otros momentos durante esta visita. Y por supuesto por su trabajo en pos de una transformación justa y ecológica. También a la revista The Intercept, que auspició la visita de Naomi. Ella viene en calidad de periodista de The Intercept. Y ahora, brevemente, presentarles a Naomi Klein, nuestra primera panelista. Naomi es una reconocida periodista y activista, además de documentalista y autora de diversos libros en temas relacionados con economía política, cambio climático, movimientos sociales. Entre sus más conocidos trabajos está el más reciente No Is Not Enough, Resisting Trump's Shock Politics and Winning the World We Need, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, de 2014, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, de 2007, No Logo, del año 2000, y ha sido además premiada por documentales como The Take y This Changes Everything. Tiene varios premios, entre ellos el Hillary Western Writers Trust Prize for Nonfiction, el International Studies Association IPE Outstanding Activist Scholar y el Sydney Peace Prize. Actualmente es corresponsal de la revista The Intercept, como mencionaba, y Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow de The Nation Institute. Naomi también es fundadora de una organización que se llama The Leap, que trabaja por la justicia climática y por generar nuevas ideas y acciones para trabajar en el entrelazamiento de las crisis que nos enfrentan hoy en día entre el cambio climático, la injusticia y el racismo. Así que además Naomi es como dijo, una activista que ha trabajado incansablemente por esos temas. Así que agradecemos enormemente a Naomi Klein por estar con nosotros. Naomi, you have the floor. Thank you.
Gracias, Gustavo. I am so pleased to be here. It was Gustavo who reached out to me really not long after Maria hit to begin the process of making this visit happen, this event happen, and it's sort of expanded in its ambition. And I want to thank everybody at Piedras, everybody here at the University of Puerto Rico who worked so hard under incredibly difficult circumstances to organize this event, and also to organize a week of activities that has taught me so much. That is not over yet, and there have been many partners in this process, many of them in this room, and I'm just tremendously grateful. And in fact, this visit to Puerto Rico has been a long time in coming. Ever since I wrote The Shock Doctrine, which came out now 11 years ago, I've been hearing from Puerto Ricans telling me it was missing a chapter, and inviting me to come learn about what is happening here in this extreme example of exploiting largely manufactured crises to push through an incredibly regressive agenda. And it's something that I've been following closely from afar. And so I also want to thank the people who have invited me before when I wasn't able to come. I want to particularly thank, for my visit here, a remarkable coalition of groups called the Climate Justice Alliance, CJA, who Gustavo mentioned, and there are many people who are part of CJA in this room. We're going to be hearing more about their remarkable work from Elizabeth Jean-Pierre very soon, but I've been able to witness the work on the ground this week, and it's given me so much hope and inspiration. So thank you. I want to thank The Intercept for sending me here and giving me a space to write and to make this documentary that's going to be coming out in a few weeks based on our time here. So watch for that. I want to thank the hardworking translators who are making all of this possible. And, as we've been traveling throughout Puerto Rico, going to Orikovitz, to Vieques just yesterday, to Salinas, to many other communities, I've just been struck by how many visionaries there are here, how many leaders there are here, how many ideas, how many living examples of the world we need are currently under construction. And there's a phrase that's used by many social movements these days, including Black Lives Matter, and that is that we have leaderful movements, which is different from some of the way we used to talk a few years back about leaderless movements, which often denied the real leadership that was there. And I want to say that this is a leaderful panel. I'm so honored to be sharing the platform here with this remarkable group of women, friends, really superheroes. So Elizabeth, Ava, Tata, Ruth, Mariolga, I'm in awe of all of you and just so excited to be in dialogue with you today. It has certainly been an interesting week to be in Puerto Rico. With this visit, as I said, has been a long time in coming, but sometimes things happen for a reason. And so, I found myself here talking about disaster capitalism at the same time as I'm racing to keep up with the disaster capitalists in real time. I've been here, as you know, in the same week that your governor announced the privatization of a service that has never been revealed as more essential, electricity. And the nakedness of the exploitation of people's trauma and need to use a moment when 30% of the people do not have electricity to say, well, we have no choice but to privatize, is really a cynicism that, though I have witnessed many examples of disaster capitalism before and chronicled them, I don't think I've ever seen anything as cynical as using the fact that so many people currently do not have electricity, need it so badly, using a reconstruction process that has been so completely corrupt and inept to exploit that to push a further corrupt privatization process. And of course, just yesterday was the unveiling of the so-called fiscal plan. And there's barely been time to metabolize, to process just how naked, how ambitious this all-out assault on the public sphere is. I mean, people have barely had a chance to read it. Every line contains another shocking revelation. It has barely been reported, but on page 50 of the fiscal plan, it says in black and white that part of how Puerto Rico is going to respond to all of the crises bearing down on it is to close 300 schools. After 500 schools have already been closed down since 2008. And as part of this, rationalizing this, is an estimate that there will be 100,000 fewer students in those schools. And so we see right there so plainly how the forced migration of Puerto Ricans, forced because it has become so impossible to say, is such an active tool of imposing austerity and, of course, privatization, because it isn't only about closing those schools. It's also going to be about changing those schools. And we know all about this, and I'll talk a little bit more about examples of how this has happened elsewhere. And overall, I think the deal is very plainly a kind of a devil's bargain, right? Where in exchange for time to repay, a little bit more time to repay an odious debt, and we're gonna hear from Ava about just how odious that debt is, and indeed time to increase that debt. So this is not debt forgiveness, as it's called, time to increase that debt. The Fiscal Control Board is extracting all of these pounds of flesh in the forms of commitments to attack essential public services and privatize them. That seems to be the deal that was announced yesterday. In the past, I've called this the shock doctrine, the exploitation of wrenching crises to ram through or smuggle through policies that devour the public sphere and further enrich a small group of already very wealthy elites. And we see this dismal cycle repeat again and again. I first used the phrase disaster capitalism when I was reporting on the Asian tsunami in 2004, that disaster that struck on Christmas Eve and took so many lives. And there was an outpouring of solidarity from around the world. And I got an email a few weeks later from an association of small fishing people who talked about what they called the second tsunami of corporatization and militarism, which was closing in so quickly, where people lost their homes in the tsunami, were moved into refugee camps in the center of the country, and while they were gone, their land was being seized. And when they came back to their homes, they met men with guns. And then came Katrina. And when I wrote The Shock Doctrine, I began and ended with Hurricane Katrina because it is such a textbook example of this phenomenon. And, there are young people in the room who were very young when Katrina happened, so I'm going to give a capsule summary of that disaster, which we have to understand that, like the disaster going on right here, is not one disaster, is not one crisis. That Katrina was a collision of multiple crises, where you had the crisis of the legacy of austerity, of failed public infrastructure. There had been warning after warning that the levees needed to be repaired, that they would not be able to withstand an extreme weather event. And one of the things that is often forgot about Hurricane Katrina, as though it was this ferocious Category 5 hurricane, by the time it got to New Orleans, it had been downgraded to a tropical storm. The levees absolutely should have held. They did not hold because it was part of this process of systematically neglecting the public sphere that is central to the neoliberal project. So that was one of the crises. And another one of the crises is the collision of that weak and neglected public sphere with increasingly heavy weather linked to climate change. We know that the storms are getting more powerful because the oceans are getting warmer. So you had that collision of weak and neglected infrastructure colliding with heavy weather. And of course, the infrastructure that is most neglected is the infrastructure that is supposed to protect poor Black and brown people. So it is not a coincidence that the most vulnerable neighborhoods in New Orleans were the neighborhoods where the poorest Black people lived. And so overlaying all of that was the reality of white supremacy, where the people who were abandoned on their rooftops holding signs that said help, who were left in the Superdome for 5 days without food and water, were then animalized in the press. And were vilified, called looters, called animals, all of this. And so it was all of these crises, all of this mixed up. And, I was in New Orleans while it was still partially underwater. And while I was there, this was less than 2 weeks after the levees broke, there was a Republican, a Louisiana congressman named Richard Baker, who was quoted in the press saying, "We couldn't clean out the public housing, but God did." They were very honest about it. They were very open about it. And, in New Orleans, it was particularly stark because after abandoning the city, as Puerto Rico was abandoned, there was then this forced evacuation at gunpoint, one-way tickets to every state in the United States. And while the city was literally emptied of its people, the public housing was demolished, the schools were closed down, reopened as charter schools. New Orleans is now the most privatized school system in the United States, and hopefully we can talk more about what has happened in particular to children with special needs, which the charter schools are able to weed out and then inflate their results. Charity Hospital, the only hospital that the major hospital that was serving low-income people in New Orleans, was never reopened after the storm. So, but there was the reason why I started the shock doctrine with this example is because there was this incredible smoking gun, and the smoking gun was the minutes from a meeting that was held just 2 weeks after the levees broke in a think tank in Washington called the Heritage Foundation. Many of you may be familiar with their work. The Heritage Foundation hosted this gathering of the Republican Study Group, which is the group of right-wing lawmakers in Congress, and other representatives from the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute. They came together and they had a brainstorming session. They came up with a list of what they called free market solutions to Hurricane Katrina and high oil prices. And there were 32 of these so-called solutions. And that list was leaked, and if you want to read it, you can look it up on my website. And in addition to the plans to demolish public housing and to close public schools and give parents vouchers that they could use in private schools, there were also these strange things in there, like drill for oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and build more oil refineries on the Gulf Coast, and create a tax-free free enterprise zone, and so on. And so what's so striking about this list is that it is all about attacking the public sphere and increasing fossil fuel production. So here you have this crisis that is born of the attacks on the public sphere, meeting the reality of climate change, and the so-called solution is to increase production of the very thing that is at the heart of the climate crisis and just decimate the public sphere altogether. So this is their idea of solutions. Now the name at the bottom of this memo, the signature at the bottom of this list of 32 free market solutions is a guy named Mike Pence, who was chair of the Republican Study Group. That seems relevant to me in this moment. All right. So you have been living this. You don't need a Canadian to come and tell you what disaster capitalism is in Puerto Rico. And it didn't just start in 2006. It started a long time before that. And this is this moment where all of these crises are merging. And this is sort of the way I see Trump himself, not as a crisis, but just the manifestation of all of these crises, this sort of multi-headed beast lolling around in that terrible suit of his. Not something new and shocking. So the message that I do have for you today, more than any other, is not that disaster capitalism is happening in Puerto Rico. You all know that. I think the more important message that we all need to understand, not just here but around the world, is that moments of crisis do not have to go the shock doctrine route. They do not need to become these opportunities for the already obscenely wealthy to grab still more. They can also go the opposite way, and they have before. They can be moments when we find our best selves, when we locate reserves of strength and focus that we never knew we had. And you know all about that too, here in Puerto Rico. You have lived it so many times in your history, and you have lived it and are living it in the aftermath of Irma and Maria. When the people most responsible for this crisis have been so systematically missing in action, your communities have come together, your communities have reached across oceans and the diaspora to hold one another in your care, organizing relief, advocating for the living and the dead, Teachers and parents have organized to keep schools open when authorities have tried to exploit this disaster, to advance that agenda of closing schools and privatizing them, and you are doing this still, more than 4 months after Maria hit, when there is still no justice, and scandalously, a third of the island still has no electricity. So you know that disasters have this power to awaken something remarkable in us. And I often, and we also, so many of us know this from our personal lives when disaster strikes, that we either fall apart and sort of regress, or we just grow up really, really fast. We don't stay the same in crisis, that's for sure. And I'm not just talking about relief here, relief from the immediate crisis, but also the long and proud history of crises sparking progressive transformation on a society-wide scale. Think of the victories won by working people for social housing and old age pensions during the Great Depression and the New Deal era. All of these reforms were far from perfect. Many people were excluded, including immigrant workers, many African American workers, many women workers. But nonetheless, much of what is being dismantled now in the form of public services, those public housing that was destroyed after Katrina, were victories that were won in the midst of crises that were understood and metabolized by societies as symptoms of a system that was failing and needed to be radically transformed. In other countries, the horrors of World War II, the sacrifices, the tremendous loss of lives, were the lever that won universal public health care. That's what happened in my country, in Canada. That's how we won universal public health care. That's how they won it in the UK, many countries. And this should remind us that moments of great crisis and peril do not need to knock us backwards. They can also catapult us forward. Our progressive ancestors achieved that in key moments in history, and I firmly believe that Puerto Ricans can do it again in this moment when everything is on the line. But what these moments in history teach us is that you don't win these victories only by saying no to the disaster capitalists, to the people who would exploit these crises for their ends. It is important to say no, don't get me wrong. I am absolutely convinced that if there is not resistance to these attempts to privatize PREPA, that will be taken as a green light to go after water, to go after education, to go after roads, bridges, ports, all of it. But in addition to that clear no, there also has to be a yes, a plan to transform societies, to recover, that gets at the underlying causes, as opposed to these false solutions that are actually about deepening them. And that plan needs to be convincing, credible, and captivating. Because one of the things we are up against, and maybe the biggest thing we are all up against around the world, is the way in which the neoliberal project, and here in Puerto Rico, in addition to that, the way in which the colonial project has systematically waged war on the collective imagination and on the very possibility of dreaming of anything beyond the bleak borders of neoliberalism. That is the essence of Margaret Thatcher's phrase, "there is no alternative." That is the essence of what Francis Fukuyama meant when he said in 1989 that history had come to an end, that this was the only way in which societies can organize themselves, and don't you dare dream of anything else. And so that is why it is so important in these moments to dream in public, to come together and put forward these plans that are better than the status quo before the crisis, because that was completely unacceptable. It was unacceptable. Political and corporate elites outside and inside Puerto Rico have wasted no time exploiting the trauma of Maria to thrust forward their ruinous false solutions. In this context of rampant disaster capitalism, there is an urgent and moral imperative for informed, caring people to come together and name the root causes behind the overlapping crises we are all facing and that have descended with such ferocity on these islands. With vultures circling, this is the critical moment for Puerto Ricans themselves, organized through the remarkable grassroots organizations in this room and outside of it, to lay out your own bold and holistic solutions, ones that simultaneously lower greenhouse gas emissions so that we can have a safe future while creating good unionized jobs and battling all forms of inequality and injustice, from racism to gender inequality to homophobia to transphobia. Doing this visionary work in the midst of a still unfolding disaster may feel impossible, and I know that it does. But if I have learned anything from my time in Puerto Rico, it is that Puerto Ricans do the impossible every single day. Thank you.